The air in Peterson's John Deere dealership hung thick and still, smelling of fresh paint, new rubber, and the faint cloying aroma of Earl Peterson's cheap cigars. It was the smell of money, or more accurately, the smell of debt, the kind that kept the lights on and Earl's belly full. It was July of 1978, and the corn out in the fields was so tall and green it looked like it was trying to touch God. A man could get rich in a year like this, or he could get buried. Silas Blackwood stood before Earl's polished oak desk, his hands resting on his hips. He wasn't a big man, but he was dense, built like a fence post that had been driven into hard ground and refused to move for 50 years. His hands were a roadmap of hardship, the knuckles swollen, the palms calloused, the fingernails permanently outlined in a thin black line of grease and soil that no soap could ever fully scrub away. He wore denim overalls over a plain grey work shirt, the kind you bought in a 3-pack at the co-op. He looked, for all intents and purposes, like a man who couldn't afford the floor mat in the cab of one of the gleaming green machines on the showroom floor. "6 of 'em, Earl," Silas said again, his voice low and steady, a rumble that seemed to come from his chest, not his throat. Brand new 4440s, with the sound guard cabs, air conditioning, quad range, the whole works. I want 'em delivered by the 1st of August. Earl Peterson leaned back in his leather chair, the springs groaning in protest. He took a slow, deliberate puff of his cigar, letting the smoke curl around his head like a foul halo. He was a man who had grown soft behind a desk, his face fleshy and pink, his eyes small and shrewd. He looked at Silas not as a customer, but as an interruption. 6. Earl chuckled, a wet, condescending sound. "Silas, what in God's name would a man like you do with 6 new 4440s? You're farming what? Your daddy's old 320 acres. One of these machines could handle that before breakfast. You got a whole army hiding out in your barn." The door to the dealership chimed, and in walked Richard Miller. Rich, as everyone called him, was everything Silas was not. He was tall and handsome, with a confident swagger and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He wore pressed khaki pants and a crisp collared shirt with the dealership's logo embroidered over the pocket. He was Earl's star customer, a man who farmed 3,000 acres and traded in his equipment every 2 years, whether it needed it or not. "Mornin', Earl," Rich boomed, clapping a hand on Earl's shoulder. He glanced at Silas and gave a dismissive nod. "Blackwood." "Rich," Earl said, his whole demeanor changing. He was beaming now. "Just talking to your boy about that new 8640 you ordered. She's a beaut. 4-wheel drive, articulated. Gonna pull that 24-foot chisel plow like it ain't even there." "That's what I like to hear," Rich said, leaning against the desk. He looked at Silas again, a smirk playing on his lips. "What's old Silas here buying? A new set of spark plugs for that rusty farmall of his?" Silas's jaw tightened, but his expression didn't change. He kept his eyes locked on Earl. "We were discussing my order, 6 4440s. Rich let out a loud laugh. "6? Are you starting a museum, Silas? You gonna park 'em in a row and charge admission?" Earl waved a placating hand at Rich, but he was smiling too. "Now, Rich, be nice. Silas here has big plans." He turned back to Silas, his tone dripping with fake patience. "Look, son, these tractors, they're 150 horsepower apiece. They're serious machines for serious operations. We've got a long list of established customers waiting for this year's allocation. Men with lines of credit at the bank, men with thousands of acres to turn." "I'm not asking for credit," Silas said, his voice as flat as the prairie horizon. "I'm paying cash. A cashier's check from the bank, right here in my pocket. You give me a final price, I'll sign the check, and your boys can start prepping them for delivery." The room went silent. Even Rich Miller stopped smirking. The idea of paying cash for 1 new tractor was unusual. Paying cash for 6 was unheard of. It was madness. Farming ran on credit, on operating loans, on leveraging this year's crop to pay for next year's seed. Cash was for groceries and gasoline, not for capital investments that cost more than a house. Earl Peterson stared at Silas, his little eyes narrowing. He saw the simple clothes, the dirt-caked boots, the weathered face. He didn't see a successful businessman. He saw a man who didn't fit. A man who didn't play the game by the established rules. And in Earl's small world, that was a dangerous thing. He couldn't fathom where Silas Blackwood would get that kind of money, and frankly, he didn't want to know. It smelled of instability. Rich Miller, with his mountain of debt, was a known quantity. The bank loved him, which meant the bank loved Earl. This was an unknown. "We don't operate that way," Earl said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "It's about relationships, Silas. About a long-term partnership with our customers and with the bank. We finance these machines. That's the model. It ensures a commitment, you see. I see you get a kickback from the bank on the loan, is what I see," Silas said, his voice cutting through the smoke-filled air. "I'm offering to take the bank out of it. It's a cleaner deal, simpler." "It's not a deal at all," Earl snapped, his patience finally breaking. He stood up, his face flushed. "I'm not selling you 6 of my prime allocation tractors so you can play some kind of big shot for a day. These are for my loyal customers. Men like Rich here, who are building a future, who understand how this business works." Rich Miller puffed out his chest, looking down his nose at Silas. "He's right, Blackwood. You got to be in the club to play the game, and you ain't in the club." Silas stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching out. He looked from Earl's angry, blotchy face to Rich's smug grin. He saw the two of them, partners in a system built on paper and promises, a house of cards shimmering in the bright summer sun. He had come in here to buy tractors, to build his own future on his own terms, with his own hard-earned money. And he was being turned away. Not because he couldn't afford it, but because he wouldn't kneel and kiss the ring of the bank. A slow, cold anger began to burn in Silas's gut. It was an old, familiar feeling. The feeling of being underestimated, of being judged by the cover and not the contents of the book. He had felt it his whole life. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right, Earl. I understand." He turned and walked towards the door, his work boots making heavy, rhythmic sounds on the clean tile floor. He didn't look back. "Yeah, you run on back to that junkyard of yours," Rich called after him. "Maybe you can find a good deal on some used tricycle parts." Silas paused with his hand on the door handle, his back still to them. He didn't turn around. He just stood there for a beat, then pushed the door open and stepped out into the blindingly bright, hot sunshine, the chime of the bell announcing his departure. Now, before I tell you what was going through Silas's mind as he walked across that gravel lot, and before I tell you about the plan that began to form, a plan that would shake this county to its very foundations, I have to ask you something. Have you ever had a door slammed in your face, not because you weren't good enough, but because you refused to play a rigged game? Have you ever been told no by a man who thought he held all the cards? Let me know your story in the comments below. Because that feeling, that righteous fire that burns in your chest when you're counted out, that's the same fire that was blazing in Silas Blackwood's soul, and he was about to use it to burn their whole world down. Silas didn't go home. He drove his dusty Ford pickup, a 1968 F100 with a 3 on the tree and more rust than paint, to the edge of town and parked across the street from the Blackwood Implement Building. The sign was faded, the paint peeling, but the name was still legible. It had been his grandfather's, then his father's. An International Harvester dealership, back in the glory days of the Farmall M&H. They'd lost the franchise in the early 60s when the big corporate territories started taking over. The building had sat empty for years, a silent monument to a bygone era. Silas owned it now, free and clear, just like he owned the 320 acres his father had nearly lost twice. He sat there for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled, just staring at the old building. He hadn't made his money farming. After his father died, Silas had leased the land out. He'd taken the one good truck his father had left him and started hauling grain. One truck became 2, then 5. He hauled gravel, steel, anything that needed moving. He worked 18-hour days, sleeping in the cab, living on coffee and stale sandwiches. He learned about logistics, about maintenance, about payroll and profit margins. He learned that the secret wasn't just working hard, it was understanding the numbers, finding the weaknesses in a system, and having the discipline to stick to a plan. When he'd saved enough, he came home, took back his land, and started farming it himself, the right way, debt-free. But Earl and Rich were right about one thing. You couldn't compete, not really, on 300 acres with 50-year-old equipment. You couldn't scale. He'd come back to farming to build something that lasted, something for the Blackwood name. The trucking company had been a means to an end. The farm was the end itself. And to build it, he needed modern iron. He got out of the truck and walked across the street, the key gritty in his hand. The lock on the big front door was stiff, but it finally turned with a groan. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of the past, the smell of old oil, dust, and dry rotted paper. Sunlight streamed through the dirty plate glass windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He could almost hear the echoes of farmers in seed corn caps talking about rainfall and commodity prices, his father's hearty laugh booming from the office in the back. He walked the floor. Here was where the new Farmall 560s had been lined up. Over there, the parts counter, with its rows of little drawers filled with bearings, gaskets, and belts. He ran a hand along the dusty counter, his fingers leaving clean streaks. He wasn't just seeing an old derelict building. He was seeing a foundation. His current machinery was a testament to his mechanical skill and his frugality. His main tillage tractor was an Oliver 1850. A good, solid machine from the mid-60s, but its Waukesha diesel engine was tired and thirsty. For planting and cultivating, he relied on two legendary Farmall M's, tractors his father had bought brand new in the late 40s. They were simple, reliable, and easy to fix. He could rebuild the carburetor on one blindfolded. He knew the precise feel of the clutch engaging, the exact note the engine hit when the timing was perfect. He had a little Ford 8N for mowing and utility work, a marvel of engineering in its own right. They were all paid for. They didn't owe a dime to any bank. But they were slow. They were small. They drank fuel and they demanded constant maintenance. Last winter he'd spent a solid week tearing down the rear end of the Oliver to replace a pinion bearing. It was a greasy, knuckle-busting job. He'd had to use a torch and a 10-pound sledge to get the bull gears off the axle shaft. While he was in there, he'd checked the hydraulic pump and found it was getting weak, the pressure dropping when the oil got hot. He'd spent another 2 days rebuilding it, carefully lapping the internal surfaces with fine grit compound until they were perfectly smooth. All the while, Rich Miller was probably down in Florida, getting a tan, knowing that if one of his new 4640s had a hiccup, a service truck from Peterson's would be out there before the engine was even cold. That was the difference. Rich was a manager, Silas was a mechanic, a welder, an operator, a farmer. The community saw Silas's old red and green and white tractors, and they saw a man stuck in the past, a man who couldn't afford new. They laughed at the clouds of black smoke his Oliver coughed out on a hard pull. They made jokes at the diner. Saw Silas's Farmall in the field today. Couldn't tell if he was cultivating beans or sending smoke signals. Rich Miller was the loudest of them all, his laughter echoing across the co-op as he told the story of Silas trying to buy 6 new deers. The story got bigger and better with each telling. Soon the rumor was that Silas had tried to pay with a suitcase full of dirty $1 bills. Silas became a local legend for all the wrong reasons. The fool on the hill, tinkering with his ancient relics, while the world of modern agriculture passed him by. He ignored the whispers, the sideways glances, the smirks. He put his head down and worked. He got his crops in on time. His fields were clean. His rows were straight. When his old John Deere 45 combine broke down in the middle of soybean harvest, a main bearing seizing up on the straw walker crankshaft, he didn't panic. He worked for 36 hours straight, under floodlights powered by a portable generator, stripping the back end of the machine down. Pressing out the old bearing race with a hydraulic jack and a custom rig he welded together on the spot and putting it all back together. He lost a day and a half. Rich, with his brand new 7700 turbo, would have been done in that time. But Silas knew something they didn't. At the end of the year, when the crops were sold and the bills were paid, Silas's bank account was full. His only costs were fuel, seed, and fertilizer. Rich Miller's check from the grain elevator, though 10 times larger than Silas's, was just a ghost. It passed through his account for a single day before the bank's automatic withdrawal system sucked it all out, paying the massive notes on his land, his equipment, his operating loan. Rich was working for the bank. Silas was working for himself. And as he stood there in the dusty silence of his grandfather's old dealership, Silas Blackwood wasn't thinking about buying tractors anymore. He was thinking bigger. Earl Peterson had made a fatal mistake. He had shown Silas the weakness in his business model, a complete dependence on the bank and a handful of over-leveraged customers. Earl thought his dealership was a fortress. Silas saw that it was a house of cards, and he knew a storm was coming. He just had to be patient. The last years of the 1970s were a gold rush for the American farmer. The whole world was hungry, and the Midwest was its breadbasket. Russian grain deals, soaring inflation, and a weak dollar sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn hit $3 a bushel, then $3.50. Soybeans went to $7, $8, $9. It was a heady time, a time when a man could bet the farm and double his money in a single season. And no one was betting bigger than Rich Miller. He became the local embodiment of the boom. Every time you saw him, he was in something new. He traded his year-old Cadillac for a new Lincoln Continental. He bought a lake house and a sleek new Mastercraft ski boat. And his machinery, well, it was the stuff of legend. The 8640 four-wheel drive was just the beginning. The next year, he was the first farmer in the county to own a John Deere 8820 combine. It was a monster, a leviathan of steel that could swallow 8 rows of corn at a time, its diesel engine roaring like a dragon. He built massive new grain bins on his farm, gleaming silver rockets that dwarfed his house. He bought another section of land, paying a record price per acre that made all the old-timers shake their heads and mutter into their coffee. He did it all with the bank's money. The First National Bank of Grafton County loved Rich Miller. He was their star pupil, and Earl Peterson was right there beside him, signing the paperwork, guaranteeing the loans, and delivering the new green paint. The two of them were the kings of the county. They'd be at the diner holding court, Rich talking about yields and Earl talking about interest rates, which were starting to creep up. Heard the Fed bumped the prime rate again, some old farmer would say, worry creasing his brow. Rich would just laugh. Cost of doing business. You gotta spend money to make money. Can't make a big splash if you're scared to get your feet wet. Then he'd look over at the corner booth where Silas always sat alone, nursing a cup of black coffee. Some people are just content to wade in the kiddie pool their whole lives. Right, Silas? Silas would just take a slow sip of his coffee and not say a word. On the outside, he was the picture of failure. While Rich was expanding, Silas was contracting. He didn't buy any more land. In fact, he sold off a small, awkward 40-acre parcel that was hard to get to. The price was so high he couldn't refuse. The other farmers saw it as a sign of surrender. Poor Silas couldn't even hang on to the little he had. They didn't see where the money was going. They didn't see him meeting with a realtor in the next town over, quietly buying 2 small brick storefronts on a main street that were undervalued. They didn't know he'd used the rest of the cash to buy a majority share in a small independent trucking company, the same one he'd once driven for. He was diversifying, spreading his risk, turning his farm profits into solid assets that had nothing to do with the price of corn. To the farming community, he was invisible. He still drove the same rusty Ford. He still wore the same patched overalls. He still ran his ancient, mismatched fleet of tractors. He was a ghost of a bygone era, a living relic. They mistook his discipline for poverty, his silence for defeat. They had no idea that he was watching, waiting, and calculating. He read the Wall Street Journal every day, delivered to his rural mailbox. He paid more attention to the financial pages than the farm report. He read about a man named Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. He read about Volcker's war on inflation, his grim determination to break its back, no matter the cost. He saw the prime interest rate tick up from 8% to 9 to 10. Rich Miller and Earl Peterson scoffed. It was a temporary thing, they said, a market correction. Prices would keep going up forever. One cool evening in the fall of 1979, Silas was finishing up his soybean harvest. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. He was on his old John Deere 45, the cabless machine rattling and shaking around him, dust and chaff filling the air. Across the road, he could see the brilliant halogen lights of Rich Miller's new 8820, moving relentlessly through a massive field, gobbling up beans at a pace Silas could only dream of. From this distance, Rich's machine looked like a spaceship, an alien craft harvesting the bounty of the earth. Silas shut his old combine down for the night, the sudden silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. The smell of diesel and dust hung heavy in the air. He listened to the powerful, confident roar of Rich's combine across the way. Then, on the wind, he heard another sound, a faint, high-pitched whine. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a hydraulic pump straining under a heavy load. A sound of something working right at its absolute limit. He looked over at Earl Peterson's dealership, miles away on the edge of town, its big yard lights just starting to flicker on against the deepening twilight. It looked like a beacon of prosperity, a temple dedicated to the gods of progress and leverage. But Silas knew better. He knew it was a powder keg, and he could hear the faint, unmistakable hiss of a lit fuse. The whole system, from Rich's overstressed combine to Earl's loan-backed inventory to the entire US economy, was straining. Something had to give. And when it did, Silas Blackwood would be ready. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap. It was the opposite. It was silence. The silence of a cloudless sky in mid-July of 1980, a sky that had forgotten how to rain. The corn, which should have been deep green and rustling with promise, took on a sickly pale green hue, the leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, as if in prayer for a drink they knew would not come. The ground in the fields turned the color of ash and cracked into intricate, cruel mosaics. For farmers like Rich Miller, who had bet everything on maximum yield, the drought was a tightening vice. His massive center-pivot irrigation systems, which he'd installed on credit, ran day and night, sucking the aquifer dry, the electric meters spinning like tops. The cost was staggering. At the diner, his booming laughter was gone, replaced by a tense, forced optimism. "Just need one good soaker," he'd say, staring out the window at the brassy sky. "One good rain, and we're right back in it." Silas watched and listened. His own corn was suffering too, but his break-even point was a fraction of Rich's. He hadn't fertilized for a 200-bushel yield. He'd aimed for a sensible 140, the kind of crop his land could produce in an average year without being pushed to the breaking point. He watched his neighbors' wells start to sputter and go dry from the constant irrigation, while his own, used only for the house and livestock, continued to provide cool, clear water. Then the second blow landed. Far away in Washington, D.C., politicians made decisions about grain embargoes and foreign policy. The effect in Grafton County was immediate and brutal. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn that had been trading at over $3 a bushel plunged to $2.20, then $2. The price at the local elevator, after basis and freight, was a pathetic $1.90. Every bushel Rich Miller harvested, even if he got a decent yield, would be sold at a loss. The final piece of the vice, the one that would crush bone, was Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve. The prime interest rate, a number most farmers had never paid much attention to, became an obsession. It climbed with terrifying speed, 12%, 15%, 18%. Rich Miller's operating loan, the lifeblood of his entire enterprise, was a variable rate note tied to the prime. The interest payments alone were suddenly more than most men's entire mortgage. The strain began to show on the machines. One hot, dusty afternoon during the soybean harvest, Silas was replacing a worn sickle bar on his old John Deere 45 when he saw the service truck from Peterson's turn down Rich Miller's lane, its lights flashing. An hour later, it was still there. Silas drove his pickup to the end of his own lane and watched through a pair of binoculars he kept under the seat. Rich's magnificent 8820 combine was dead in the middle of the field, a wounded giant. A mechanic in green coveralls had the side panels off, and Silas could see the complex nest of hydraulic lines and wiring harnesses inside. The problem wasn't a simple broken belt or a clogged fuel filter. This was something deep in the machine's guts. Later, at the parts counter in town, Silas overheard the mechanic talking to Earl Peterson. "Hydrostatic drive pump is shot," the mechanic said, wiping grease from his hands. "Completely grenaded. Sent metal shavings through the whole system. We'll have to flush every line, replace both wheel motors and the main pump. The pump alone is a factory-only item. 10 days to get it here, if we're lucky." Earl's face was pale. "And the cost?" The mechanic just shook his head. "You don't want to know. It's more than what Silas's whole combine is worth. For 10 crucial days of harvest weather, Rich Miller's $300,000 combine sat idle while Silas's ancient rattling machine chugged along, slowly, steadily, bringing in his crop. The cracks in Earl Peterson's empire began to appear. His lot, once a gleaming showcase of new inventory, started to look cluttered. Used equipment, traded in on the promise of the boom, sat collecting dust, its value plummeting with the price of corn. Then the repossessions started. A nearly new 4640 appeared one morning, then a big disc, then a planter. They were machines Earl had sold on credit, backed by his own dealership's financing arm. And now they were coming back, worth less than what was owed. The bank was getting nervous, and when the bank got nervous, Earl got squeezed. The cheap cigars were gone, replaced by nervously chewed toothpicks. The jovial, back-slapping salesman was replaced by a grim-faced accountant who saw red ink everywhere he looked. Silas saw it all. He saw the fear in men's eyes at the co-op. He heard the hushed, desperate conversations. He felt the mood of the county shift from unbridled optimism to a quiet, creeping dread. He said nothing. He just worked, paid his bills with cash, and put his money in the bank. He was a rock in the middle of a raging river, and the water was rising fast. The winter of 1981 was bleak and cold, but the real chill was economic. The new year brought no relief. Interest rates hit an unbelievable 21%. The papers were full of grim news. International Harvester, the company that had built Silas's trusty farmalls, was bleeding money, on the verge of collapse. Alice Chalmers was rumored to be next. The whole foundation of American agriculture was crumbling. In Grafton County, the auction notices began to appear in the weekly paper. At first, it was small operators, men who had stretched too far. The auctions were somber affairs. Neighbors stood in silence, their hats in their hands, as a man's life work was sold off piece by piece. They bid on small items, a wrench set, a chain hoist. Not because they needed them, but as a small gesture of support, a way to put a few dollars into a neighbor's empty pocket. Then, in April, the notice appeared that everyone had been dreading, but expecting. The bankruptcy and liquidation auction of Miller Farms, Inc., by order of the First National Bank of Grafton County. 3,000 acres, 3 houses. A fleet of machinery that had been the envy of the entire state. The day of the auction was grey and windy. It felt like a funeral. The whole county was there, not out of spectacle, but out of a morbid sense of shared destiny. Rich Miller was there, but he was a ghost of his former self. His swagger was gone, his shoulders slumped. He stood beside his wife, who wept silently as the auctioneer's staccato chant dismantled his empire. The big-ticket items went for a song. The 8820 Combine, with its recently repaired hydrostatic drive, sold for less than half of what Rich had paid for it. The articulated 8640, his pride and joy, was bought by a corporate farm from 2 states away. Earl Peterson stood near the auction truck, his face the color of putty. Every time the gavel fell on a piece of John Deere equipment, it was another nail in his own coffin. The bank would get its money first, and there wouldn't be much left for the dealer who had extended the credit. Silas was there too. He stood at the back of the crowd, his hands in his pockets. He didn't bid on anything. He wasn't there to gloat or to pick over the bones. He was there to witness the inevitable conclusion of a philosophy he had rejected. He watched as Rich Miller, the man who had mocked him, who had called him a relic, was stripped of everything. He felt no pleasure in it, only a profound and weary sadness. This is what happened when you built your house on the sand of other people's money. While his neighbors were going broke, Silas was surviving. He was more than surviving. He was stable. The drought had hurt his yields, and the low prices stung, but he had no debt. His income was his own. When the injector pump on his Oliver 1850 started leaking, he didn't call a mechanic. He pulled it off himself, ordered a seal kit that cost $12, and rebuilt it on his kitchen table one evening, the smell of diesel fuel mingling with the aroma of his supper. He had time, and he had knowledge, 2 assets that weren't listed on any bank's balance sheet. Men who had once laughed at his old red tractors now came to him for help. "Silas, my old 4020 won't start. You got any idea what it could be?" "Silas, I need to weld a crack in my loader bucket, but I can't afford the shop rate. Could you take a look? He never said no. He'd go over after his own chores were done, diagnose a faulty solenoid with a cheap multimeter, or lay a perfect bead of weld with his portable welder. He'd charge them a few dollars for his time, or more often than not, just accept a cup of coffee and the quiet gratitude in their eyes. He was no longer the fool on the hill. He was becoming the bedrock of a shattered community. The fall of Rich Miller sent shockwaves through the local economy, and the epicenter was Peterson's John Deere. With its star customer gone and dozens of other farmers defaulting, the dealership was hemorrhaging money. Deere and Company, facing its own crisis, had no patience for a failing franchise. They sent a team of corporate auditors in dark suits who went over Earl's books with merciless precision. They saw the mountain of bad debt, the overvalued used inventory, the reliance on a single, now bankrupt customer. The bank, which had once been Earl's partner, was now his executioner. They called his loans. Earl had nothing. The house of cards, built on leverage and easy credit, collapsed in a single gust of wind. The First National Bank of Grafton County took possession of the dealership, the building, the land, the parts, the tools, everything. It was just another toxic asset on their books, another casualty of the farm crisis they had helped create. They put a sign out front, closed. The gleaming green temple was shuttered. For farmers who needed parts or service, it was a disaster. The next nearest dealer was 70 miles away. One cool morning in early spring, Silas Blackwood put on his one good suit, a simple dark wool outfit he'd bought for his father's funeral and hadn't worn since. He drove his old Ford pickup not to the dealership, but to the imposing brick building of the First National Bank downtown. He walked past the bewildered tellers and asked to see the bank president, Mr. Harrison. Harrison was a man drowning in his own mistakes. His office, once a symbol of power, now felt like a bunker under siege. He looked at Silas, this quiet farmer in an ill-fitting suit, with weary disdain. He expected another plea for an extension, another hard-luck story. Silas sat down. He didn't plead, he didn't complain. He laid a single folded piece of paper on Harrison's polished desk. It was a certified financial statement prepared by an accountant from the city. It showed in stark black and white detail Silas's net worth. The unmortgaged farmland, the commercial properties, the shares in the trucking company, the cash, lots of cash. Harrison's eyes widened as he read. He had completely misjudged this man. "The dealership," Silas said, his voice calm and even, "it's a liability to you. It's sitting empty, losing value every day. You need it off your books before the federal examiners come for their annual review." Harrison nodded slowly, the blood draining from his face. Silas knew exactly where the pressure points were. "I'm prepared to make you an offer," Silas continued. "I will buy the entire asset. The land, the building, the complete inventory of parts and equipment, and the franchise agreement, which I know you now control. I will pay cash. The deal will close in 7 days. There will be no financing, no contingencies." Silas named his price. It was a lowball offer, barely 30 cents on the dollar of what the dealership was once worth. But it was a clean deal. It was a lifeline. For Harrison, it was the only way out. He looked at Silas, a man he and his bank had dismissed and ignored, and saw his salvation. "Sold," Harrison said, his voice barely a whisper. A week later, Silas walked into the dealership. The air was stale and dead. Earl Peterson was there, clearing out his personal effects from the big oak desk. He looked 10 years older, a defeated man adrift in the wreckage of his life. He saw Silas and his face hardened with a mixture of shame and resentment. "Come to dance on the grave, Blackwood?" Earl spat, shoving a framed picture into a cardboard box. Silas walked over and looked at the desk, at the deep scratches in the wood where Earl had nervously tapped his pen for years. He felt no anger, no need for revenge. He just saw the end of a sad story. "No, Earl," Silas said quietly. "I came to open for business." He paused. "I'm going to need a good parts man. Someone who knows the numbers, knows the stock. The job is yours if you want it. You'll answer to my general manager, but you'll have a steady paycheck." Earl stared at him, his mouth agape. He had expected vengeance, a final humiliation. He was being offered grace. He swallowed hard, his pride warring with his desperation. He looked around the silent showroom, the only world he had ever known. Finally, he gave a single jerky nod. He couldn't bring himself to speak. 2 days later, Silas found Rich Miller. It wasn't hard. He was working at the gas station on the highway, pumping gas and washing windshields, the smell of gasoline clinging to him like a shroud. He moved like a man in a trance, his eyes hollow. Silas pulled his truck up to the pumps. Rich came over, avoiding his eyes, and started to unscrew the gas cap. "Rich," Silas said. Rich froze, then slowly looked up. He expected a taunt, a final, "I told you so." "Your daddy's old place," Silas said, referring to the original 160 acres Rich had inherited before his expansion. Silas had bought it at the auction. "The house is empty. The barn is solid. I need a good tenant to live there. Keep an eye on the place. Rent will be $1 a year. You can farm the land, take all the profit. Pay me back for the seed when you can." Tears welled in Rich Miller's eyes. He leaned against the truck, his body shaking with silent, racking sobs. He had lost an empire, and the man he had scorned the most was offering him a home. The grand reopening of Blackwood Implement was the talk of the county. The sign out front was a perfect replica of the one that had hung there when his grandfather ran the place. Inside, things were different. Silas had pushed the new, expensive tractors to the back. Up front, he had a massive display of parts, not just for the new models, but for the old 4020s, the 3010s, the Farmals, the Olivers. He had set up a machine shop in the service bay that could rebuild a worn-out water pump or resurface a cylinder head. The focus was no longer on selling new debt, it was on keeping old iron working. The community, once so quick to judge him, now saw him as a savior. He extended credit for parts based not on a bank's approval, but on his own knowledge of a man's character. He sponsored the local 4-H club. He hosted free clinics on engine maintenance and welding. He was rebuilding his community with the same quiet competence he used to rebuild a carburetor. Years passed. The farm economy slowly healed, leaner and more cautious than before. One sunny afternoon in the late 1980s, Silas was in the back of the shop. He was older now, his hair streaked with grey, but his hands were as steady as ever. He was working on his father's old Farmall M, meticulously setting the valve lash. His son, a teenager with his father's quiet eyes, stood beside him, handing him tools. "Why do you still mess with this old thing, Dad?" the boy asked. "We've got a whole lot full of new tractors." Silas wiped a smear of grease from the valve cover with a clean rag. He looked at the simple, rugged engine, an engine he knew as well as his own reflection. "This tractor," he said, his voice a low rumble, "it teaches you something. It doesn't have a computer to tell you what's wrong. You have to listen to it. You have to feel it. See this push rod?" He held it up. "It's a simple piece of steel. You can understand it. You can fix it. You can depend on it." He turned and looked his son in the eye. "Out there," he said, gesturing toward the showroom, "they're selling machines. In here, we're learning about foundations. Never build your life on something you don't understand, and never owe more than you can pay. Your name, your word, and the land under your feet, that's the only real capital you'll ever have." He placed the valve cover back on the engine and began to gently tighten the bolts, his movements sure and practiced. The late afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows of the shop, illuminating the old red tractor, a monument not to the past, but to an enduring, hard-won wisdom. The Blackwood name was once again a mark of respect in Grafton County, not for its size or its shine, but for its unshakable strength. And in the quiet, rhythmic turn of his wrench, Silas knew he had built something that would last,